Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the privilege of being recognized to address you here on the floor of the United States House of Representatives. And I won't at this time take up all the issues that were raised in the previous 45 minutes or so, Mr. Speaker. Instead, I'd like to talk about two topics, though. And one of those topics is the topic of the Farm Bill, which historically, in a sad way, failed here on the floor of the House of Representatives within the last hour or so, hour and a half. And the first thing I want to say about that is that the chairman of the Ag Committee, Frank Lucas of Oklahoma, has conducted himself in a fashion that is deserving and receives my admiration and should that of his constituents and the people in this country. One of the most difficult balances to achieve in any bill that we produce here in Congress is that 5-year, we call it the Farm Bill, the 5-year Farm Bill that has roughly 80% nutrition in it, about 20% agriculture in it. In each 5 years, we try to write the best formula and look into the crystal ball for the next 5 years as well as we can. And it takes the chairman of the Ag Committee, which is the least partisan of the committees here on the Hill, to direct the committee staff, which are very experienced and some of the best staff people we have here on the Hill, to work with the ag staff of the Democrat side, or the opposite party, and work with the ranking member to try to bring together such a variety of issues that have to do with sugar and dairy and crop insurance and nutrition and the qualifications for nutrition. Piece after piece of this, it's like a huge accordion, and the chairman of that committee has got to make decisions on each component of that huge accordion to try to get it lined up in a way that if you go a little too far into the necessary reduction in the food stamp side, you lose votes over here on the Democrat side. If you don't take enough out of there, you lose votes on the Republican side. If you don't take enough money out of agriculture, you lose it over here on some of the conservative side. And on the other hand, if you don't have enough subsidy, you lose votes on the Democrat side. This is a very difficult balance, Mr. Speaker. And the marriage between the Farm Bill and the nutrition component of this, or the agriculture component and the nutrition component that we erroneously call the Farm Bill here because of history, that marriage was created out of necessity because the farm program could not be passed on its own. There were too many opponents to that, and the nutrition program had too much opposition on its own. And they married the two together, and each 5 years or so, and it hasn't always happened in 5 years. I don't know if it's ever actually happened perfectly. It's been dialed together as closely as possible and asked for cooperation from Democrats and Republicans to finally come together and pass a bill. Frank Lucas put that together as perfectly as I think it could be done. I think, Mr. Chairman, that he was a maestro in the way he orchestrated all of this. And I watched as we went through the committee markup. We did one last year and couldn't get floor time to debate a bill. And so the work of the committee wasn't necessarily wasted because we started again this year. And we began to put the pieces together again. And we had a long markup of the bill, an extended markup of the bill, not as long as it was the previous year. And the pieces came together, and here's what it needed. It needed to have a strong bipartisan support coming out of committee before it was going to get floor time. And it needed to have a reasonable prospect of 218 votes here on the floor of the House before that floor time would be granted. And as we've seen from the Speaker, he has consistently said that he wants to see the House work its will. Now, he let that happen on a continuing resolution in January, or I'll say February of 2011, and we did 92 hours of debate here on the floor under an open rule on every aspect of the budget. That was the House working its will, and that was the longest and the most expressive way that I have seen this House work its will. But the Rules Committee here on the Farm Bill that came out of the Ag Committee allowed a whole series of amendments here on the floor. The chairman spoke to that number. I think he said over 100 amendments here on the floor. And yes, there was an agreement made under unanimous consent to pass a group of them that were not contentious en bloc, as we say. I think there was a real sincere effort to work a bill out here on the floor that would come to a conclusion that received 218 votes. And today, Mr. Speaker, we saw an example of when that didn't work. When an amendment or two or three went on that were more of an objection to that careful and delicate balance that had been put together by Frank Lucas. And in the end, when the votes could not come together, and a very rare thing, a 5-year bill that actually has been 6 years since we passed one, failed here on the floor of the House of Representatives. Mr. Speaker, I won't forget this day. And I hope that this Congress, and I hope the American people, and I hope especially the constituents of Frank Lucas remember the job that he has done. I don't ever remember seeing anybody in this Congress work so wisely, so honestly, so justly, so carefully to put together something that had to be so carefully balanced. To have a glass of cold water thrown in his face is what happened here, I think, on the floor today. So I wanted to express my regret that the Farm Bill failed here today, and my appreciation for Frank Lucas, for the subcommittee chairs and the ranking members that worked with us on this, those that gave their word and kept it. I thank all of them. And Mr. Speaker, I'm hopeful that the day will come that that work that has been earned is exonerated by a vote here on the floor of the House. In either case, I want the record to reflect my opinion and my appreciation for Frank Lucas. We've had a big week here, Mr. Speaker. And in this big week and this big day that I'll just call yesterday, I look back on it after a full day and I wondered, one, how would one actually do all the things that were accomplished yesterday? I just want to run through that narrative because it's fresh in my mind. And that is that yesterday we did the longest press conference in the history of Congress. I don't know what competition there might have been for that. Now, who would want to have a long press conference? Well, somebody that wanted to have a long time to about a huge issue. And the issue was immigration. And I have believed for some weeks now, in fact 2 or 3 months, that the machinery of this Congress was set up to push immigration, and I'll call it comprehensive immigration reform, close quote, which is, of course, the euphemism for amnesty, through this Congress faster than the Congress could adjust to it, learn about the policy within the issues, and faster than the American people could learn about it and weigh in. We always need to move at the pace of the American people so that they have a chance to let us know what they think. And we have a chance to digest that policy and make those decisions. This immigration issue was moving too fast. I believed, and I believe, that it was accelerated too quickly in the United States Senate. I believe that today. It's moving too quickly without enough debate. It's too big a decision to be made. I believed, and I believe, that it's still moving too quickly through the House of Representatives. And I would point out that there was a gang of 8 in the Senate. There remains a gang of 8 in the Senate that had been meeting in private and holding some press conferences talking about the things that they were attempting to do that finally rolled out a bill. I believe it was rolled out at 844 pages long. And the debate and the markup that took place in the Judiciary Committee in the United States Senate was relatively long. There were a good number of amendments that were offered, but most of those votes, some might even say all of those votes, just came down the lines of whether they were part of the deal or whether they weren't part of the deal. So it looked like the Gang of 8 had a deal going into the Judiciary Committee markup. They certainly came out of that with their deal intact, and it's to the floor of the United States Senate today. That's fast and fast track. And while that's going on, the attention of the American people on this issue has been split between the United States Senate and the House. There's been a working group, a bipartisan working group in the House also. In the Senate, it's 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans on the Gang of 8 in the House. I learned not that long ago that the working group was 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans. I also learned that the Speaker encouraged their work, and I learned that they were working in secret for perhaps the last 4 years. Well, it was in secret. I believe, served more time in the seat, listening, hearing immigration information, and reading through reports, probably than anybody else on my side of the aisle over the last decade, although there are 2 or 3 that I think have a high level of expertise on immigration policy. My antennae aren't that weak here, Mr. Speaker, that I'm not picking up the signals of what's going on behind closed doors, We talk, we flow through here to vote, we meet with each other. But I didn't know that there was a secret committee working here out of the House of Representatives that had the blessing of the Speaker. I didn't know that until it was announced by the press some weeks ago. And the secret committee that didn't admit to its existence, some of them facetiously spoke about it as that secret committee, even though they finally admitted, and the press, I think, ferreted this out, that they were on that committee. This committee of 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats in the House of Representatives that was secret. Now it's not a committee of 8 any longer. It's a committee of 8 minus 1, at least as far as I know. Their ability to produce a bill seems to have been stalled here in this Congress. I'm not sorry about that. About the same time that conclusion may have been drawn, I heard our Speaker, I believe it was 2 weeks ago on Friday at his press conference, say he hoped to see immigration legislation pass out of the Judiciary Committee in the month of June. Well, that was a surprise to me, and when the announcement came shortly thereafter that we should clear our schedules for this week and next week as members of the Judiciary Committee to prepare for markup on immigration, I saw that as a green flag that was dropped. That moves the immigration policy more quickly here in the House of Representatives, and I'm comfortable with. But I do not criticize the conduct of our chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Bob Goodlatte is one of the more astute people on policy that we have in this Congress. He is a seasoned and knowledgeable and smart legislator, and he sees the pieces that are moving and understands what he needs to do to move the right pieces. And I have served with him on 2 committees now for more than 10 years. And yet, the pace that's going through this Congress may be a wise one. It may be a wise one if enforcement first is what emerges here from the House of Representatives. And if the bill in the Senate can be slowed down or stopped in the Senate. The consensus that I hear among the Republican conference in the House of Representatives is this, Mr. Speaker. Stop the bleeding at the border. Shut off the bleeding at the border. Close the border. Get that done. And when you get that done, then come back and talk about the other things. I'd make the point that when I came here a little more than 10 years ago, I said then, let's stop the bleeding at the border. We've got to close the border. I came to this floor, and when people said, well, we can't, I've advocated long that we should build a fence, a wall, and a fence on our southern border. And that fence, wall, and fence that we can build on the border would be what would be help to secure our border. I agree that we would add to that sensory devices, vibration sensors, motion detectors, you name it, add all of that to it. But you simply cannot have enough Border Patrol agents to control 2,000 miles of border with the conditions that we have. They have to rotate shifts, they get their vacations, there's time off. It takes a lot of people on payroll to have enough people on the ground, and we know that there's bleeding through that border, a lot that's crossing through the border. Mr. Speaker, I went down and did a surprise visit to a port of entry at Sassabee, Arizona. And when I walked in there, they didn't know a member of Congress was about ready was showing up there. I spoke with the shift supervisor, and his name was Mike Kring. And he since passed away, sadly, and I think that he was a strong enforcement officer. He was well respected by his men that I saw around him. But I asked him about the frequency of the crossing there at the legal crossing at the port of entry, which is pretty much a rural port of entry in Sassabee, Arizona. And he said, well, this crossing isn't the busiest crossing near here. There's an illegal crossing east of me that's far busier and an illegal crossing west of me that's far busier. This is just our formal crossing. And that tells you something about what's going on the border. We can close the border. We can do it with the resources that we have. I've long said that. I've not changed my position. I think it's stronger rather than weaker. And I may be the only one that's actually gone back and done the work to calculate what we're spending to defend our southern border. And these numbers are old, Mr. Speaker, that I'm about to quote here this afternoon. They come to this, that when you add up, there's a 50-mile area north of our southwest border. Within that 50 miles, You will see Border Patrol agents, Custom Border Protection agents. You'll see ICE agents in there also. And the effort that's done to control our border also, it's the cost of their vehicles, their communications, the benefits package, all of the things in that area. When you add that all up and you divide it out by the 2,000 miles, which is pretty close to it's the best number to use for the length of the border and the southern border, you end up with this number. And this number would be adjusted upward, not downward, to get it more current than the roughly 3 years ago that I'm talking about. $6 million a mile. We're spending $6 million a mile at a minimum every year to control our southern border. And we're getting, according to Border Patrol testimony before the Immigration Subcommittee, about 25% enforcement. They think that of the 100 people that would try to cross the border, they might be stopping about 25%. Now, it's probably gotten a little better in the last couple of years, but when I go down to the border, Mr. Speaker, and I ask the agents there candidly, without identifying themselves and without going on public record, what percentage of the illegal border crossers are we interdicting? The most consistent number I get is 10%, not 25%. Some will smirk and say, or not really smirk, but they'll just kind of snort and say, well, 3 or 4%. The real answer is, we don't know. They know more than we do. The 10% number seems to me to be more likely to be an accurate number than the 25% number. But think of this. At the peak of the illegal border crossings, we would have about 11,000 a night. That comes from 4 million illegal crossing attempts a year. 11,000 a night. Twice the size of Santa Anna's army coming across our border every night on average. And maybe those illegal crossings have been reduced by half. Maybe. That's still the size of Santa Anna's army every night. And we're talking about whether we should legalize the people that came across that border, and we're assuming by the argument of, say, Mr. Gutierrez of Illinois and many others that they're all innocent people that were brought in by their parents, maybe against their will, certainly without their knowledge that there was anything wrong with it or illegal with it, that's the universe of all the people that are unlawfully present in the United States are just simply those that wanted to come to America for a better life. Mr. Speaker, I go down to the border. I sit alongside that fence at night. I don't have night vision, but I have ears, and I can sit in the dark, and I can hear the vehicles come down through the mesquite. In fact, when you hear the one with the bad muffler come back a second time and a third time, you know they're shuttling people to come across the border at night. And within the last, say, an hour after dark to the next 2, 3, 4 hours after dark is when the highest traffic is, because they know they've got to walk across the desert a long ways, and they want to make as much time as they can before it turns daylight, where they might hole up or where they might be picked up if they can get to the highway north of there. And so I listen, and I hear the vehicles come through across the desert. I hear the mesquite scratch along the side of the vehicle, and you hear the doors open. Maybe 70, 80, 90, 100 yards south of the border, you can hear the doors open. You can hear people get out. First they open the door. You can hear them drop their pack on the ground. And then they get out, and then they close the door, kind of quietly, but it's still it's a quiet slam of the door. And you can hear them pick up their packs, whisper, and you hear them walk through the brush, and you can hear them cross the fence. And when you're down there at night without night vision, you sometimes think you see some things you don't see. If you ever sat around at night in a pitch black dark and watched, your mind will play tricks on you. I can't say into the record, Mr. Speaker, that I saw good numbers of people walk across the border. I know I heard them. It's the only place they could have been going. I heard them go through the fence. I believe I saw the shadows, but I'm not certain of that particular component. I'm very confident that there are hundreds and hundreds of people that pour across that border at night, and that number that I said is roughly half of 11,000. The size of Santa Anna's army, which was 5,000 to 6,000, is roughly the number that we will see every night. Now, this border is wide open from that perspective, and all of the people that came into America aren't those that are coming through that path. And all of those people that are coming into America across that border, sometimes you'll see a pack train of 75, and every one of them will have a pack of marijuana on their back, and they're carrying it into the United States, smuggling it into the United States. Those people fit under the DREAM Act definition too. If they came into the United States before they were 16, and if they'd been here whatever the length of time might be, if they came here before December 31st, 2011 would be the Senate version of the bill. I've been on the border, Mr. Speaker, and seen the shadow wolves interdict a smuggler, a marijuana smuggler, coming through with a false bed in the box of a pickup truck that was extended downward about 7 to 9 inches, and underneath that were the bales of marijuana. I unloaded them myself and took them up to the scales where they were weighed, and they weighed approximately 240 pounds. The reason for that, Mr. Speaker, 240 pounds, is because in some sectors of the border, they don't have the ability to prosecute drug smugglers, and so they set a limit. The prosecutors will set a limit. Sometimes it's you have to have more than 500 pounds of marijuana to be prosecuted. Sometimes you have to have more than 250 pounds of marijuana to be prosecuted. The smugglers know that. I'm going to guess that the sector that I was in that day, the limit was, at least anticipated by the smugglers, to be 250 pounds. So they dialed it under 250 to about 240 pounds and sent their guy through. And he was caught. And what we don't know is, was that a decoy so that when all converged on that smuggler, that there wasn't a straight truck through with a couple of tons of marijuana in it? I don't know that. Those are tactics that we see. And that's tactics of using sometimes illegal crossings, sometimes going through the legal crossings that we have. A lot of the border isn't marked. Across New Mexico, there's a concrete pylon from horizon to the next horizon that's just set there, and you'd have to know what you were looking for to know where the border is. It's just open desert. And I've flown most of that, a lot of that at night. And I've also traveled, I'll say that I've traveled probably every mile of our southern border, with the exception of some of the miles along the Texas border, which zigzags quite a lot, and I haven't covered all of that. But, Mr. Speaker, we can build a fence, a wall, and a fence, and we can do it with less money than we're spending today on the southern border. Over $6 million a mile on the southern border. And to put this in perspective, to build an interstate across Iowa cornfield, expensive now, today expensive Iowa cornfield, we can buy the right-of-way. We can pay for the engineering. We can do the grading and the drainage work and the paving and the shouldering and the painting and the signage and the seating and the fencing, all of that, and open up a 4-lane interstate highway for about $4 million a mile. And we're spending $6 million on every single mile of our southern border, and we're getting something like 25% or less efficiency with what we have there. And part of it is because the President has declared by executive edict amnesty. And even though I think the Border Patrol is doing their job as well as they can within those limits, it's clear that ICE has been handcuffed. We have had the President of the ICE Union, Chris Crane, testify before this Congress. I think he's been 9 times into this city within the last year and a half or so, doing a stellar job of pointing out that the law requires the federal immigration officers to place into removal proceedings those people that they encounter that are unlawfully present in the United States. And it's their judgment on that that dictates. Well, the President's prohibited them from doing so through the Morton memos. The Morton memos that have been rejected by this Congress in 2 ways within the last 3 weeks or so. One is a full vote of the House on the King Amendment, and the other one is a vote of the Judiciary Committee on the King Amendment. And so we have, every way that we've had the opportunity, rejected the idea that the President can simply make up immigration law out of thin air, decide that he can issue work permits, that he can legalize people that are here illegally, that he can, by executive edict, destroy the rule of law. Destroy the rule of law. I often talk about the pillars of American exceptionalism. We are a great country, Mr. Speaker, and this great country that we are relies upon this America that Ronald Reagan described as the shining city on the hill, This city is built on the beautiful marble pillars of American exceptionalism. They are, many of them within the Bill of Rights. Freedom of speech, religion, the press, and assembly, all wrapped up in the First Amendment to our Constitution. There are property rights in the Fifth Amendment. There's a prohibition on double jeopardy. You get to be faced by your accuser and a jury of your peers. The states and personal rights that are reserved in the Ninth and Tenth Amendment, all those are pillars of American exceptionalism. So is free enterprise capitalism. If we had none of that, we wouldn't have the nation we are. If you build, and I want to add to that, the core of our culture is Judeo-Christianity. We welcome people of all religions. The foundation of the American civilization is Judeo-Christianity, and without it, we can't be the America we are either. So think of this beautiful shining city on the hill that Reagan so eloquently described for us, sitting on the beautiful marble pillars of American exceptionalism. But I can't think of that city sitting there without also thinking of an essential pillar of exceptionalism called the rule of law. Now, if you would take a jackhammer and chisel away that marble pillar of American exceptionalism, which is freedom of speech, and destroy freedom of speech, the beautiful edifice of our shining city on the hill would crumble and fall. If you did the same thing to freedom of the press, our shining city on the hill would crumble and fall. If you took away our Second Amendment rights, which I didn't mention, but are a pillar of American exceptionalism, eventually our other freedoms would crumble and fall, and tyrants would take over. If you put people subject to double jeopardy, we wouldn't be the civilization we are, and the rule of law wouldn't mean what it does. It would crumble and fall. If you destroy the rule of law, if you have contempt for the rule of law, if the Supreme Court disregarded the rule of law, and if they ruled on interpreting their law to be their whim, their wish, not the very definition of the supreme law of the land being our Constitution. And as the President so well described, March 28, 2011, before a high school here in Washington, D.C., when he was asked, why don't you just implement the DREAM Act by executive order? His answer was, to the students who were listening, I don't have the constitutional authority to do that. You've been studying the Constitution. You as students know that it's the job of the legislature to pass the laws, the job of the executive branch to enforce the laws, and the job of the judicial branch to interpret the laws. Now, that's an accurate description, as should aptly come from a former adjunct professor of constitutional law at the University of Chicago. That is our president. He knew what he was talking about, and that description was consistent with his oath of office, Mr. Speaker. The oath of office is defined within our Constitution. It's specific. It has been concluded with, so help me God, for a long time. But within that oath is also the oath to preserve and protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. And in the Constitution, it requires the President of the United States, our Chief Executive Law Enforcement Officer and Commander-in-Chief, to, quote, take care that the laws be faithfully executed, close quote. That doesn't mean, Mr. Speaker, execute the law. It doesn't mean execute the rule of law. It doesn't mean execute the Constitution itself. It means you take an oath, and your job is to uphold the law, take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Well, the President has defied his own oath of office. He's defied the rule of law. He's defied the Constitution, and he said, I'm not going to enforce the law. I'm not going to enforce the laws that I don't like. I disagree with some of the immigration policy that's been passed by Congress and signed by one of his predecessors, in fact, signed by Bill Clinton. He's refusing to enforce those kind of laws. That does great damage to the Constitution, and it throws the balance of the three branches of government out of whack. And our founding fathers imagined that there would be competition for power and influence between the three branches of government. They envisioned it always with three branches of government: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch of government. This Congress is in Article 1. That means we are more the voice of the people than any other branch of government. That was the first and most important branch. But they also knew that they had to have a strong chief executive, a strong president, a strong commander-in-chief. The experiences they went through in fighting a revolutionary war with the Continental Congress told them you can't have a strong national defense without a strong commander-in-chief. So they established that. And they established the balance between the legislative branch in Article 1 and the executive branch in Article 2, and also the balance, and I think to a slightly lesser degree, between the judicial branch. But think of it as a triangle. And they envisioned that each branch of government would seek to expand its power. That's human nature. You always want more power than you actually have. Whether you take this thing from the Pope to the President, right on down the line to senators, which have 1/100th of the power of the Senate chamber, House members that have 1/435th of the House chambers. We always want to have a little more leverage, a little more influence. Get your hands on a gavel, or maybe become the majority leader, the minority leader, the Speaker of the House. And actually, the former Speaker of the House, Speaker Pelosi, just walked across this floor, Mr. Speaker, and she would understand that, as we all do. In a family, you always want to have more influence. If the patriarch of the family is the one that writes the rules, you always think, you always grate a little bit underneath that. Well, that's a natural thing, to always try to grab a little bit more power. They knew it was human nature. And so they set up this balance between the three branches of government. But they envisioned that each branch of government would jealously protect its constitutional authority and not concede it to the usurpation of some other branch of government. They envisioned that Congress would try to grow in its influence and authority, and they gave the President veto power so that he could veto the overreach, potentially, of the House and the Senate together. They balanced the House and the Senate so that this hot cup of coffee hot cup of tea, they were thinking, here in the House of Representatives, which can be a quick reaction force when things go wrong in America. A new crop of House members come in with the freshest of vigor that comes from the American people, and they set about changing things. That's a 2-year election cycle. We saw that in 2010 when 87 new freshman Republicans came into the House of Representatives, every single one of them having run for office on the promise to repeal Obamacare, every single one. Meanwhile, while the House was being heated up, the Senate itself, which if all senators, rather than roughly a third of them, were up for election each cycle, I think we would have seen the majority turnover in the United States Senate, but it didn't quite do that. So the Senate has been the cooling saucer to the hot cup of tea or coffee that is the House. Our founding fathers saw that, and they wanted to balance that. They wanted to have the longer view in the Senate. They wanted the quick reaction forces in the House. They wanted to blend them together, and they did. I think they did a very good job of that. But they also wanted to then check an overreach of Article 1, the legislative branch of the Congress, by giving the President of the United States veto power. And at the same time, they put constraints on the President because we can control the activities of the executive branch through the appropriations, if we can actually control the appropriations here in the House of Representatives. So they granted that authority. But they expected that there would be like a tug of war for that power. They did not think that the President of the United States would take an oath of office to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States and be required to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, and then go out and execute the law rather than enforce the law. But that's what's happened. The President has, with impunity, defied the rule of law and simply canceled immigration law that exists on the books that requires ICE and federal immigration law enforcement officers to place those individuals unlawfully here in removal proceedings. That's the law. The President suspended it, and what has happened here in Congress? Well, there was an election after he did that. March 28, 2011, he said, I don't have the power to, by executive order, implement the DREAM Act. March 28, 2011. June 15, 2012, he assumed that authority. And he simply suspended the rule of law and imposed his will, his wish on America. And what happened? The people that took an oath to uphold the Constitution and the rule of law decided that they were going to honor the lawlessness. And they decided that they were going to comply with the president's order because, well, their jobs were on the line for one thing, but I say also they have an oath of office for another. And when that happened, when there's a dispute between the legislative branch and the executive branch of government, the judicial branch needs to step in to sort out that dispute. I know they don't like to do that, Mr. Speaker. And so, in any case, I asked for a meeting and invited people to come to the table, which they did, and we discussed how we move forward to put a block on the President's unconstitutional assumption of legislative authority, the violation of the separation of powers. I had been through that litigation in the past in an issue I'll not take up here, but it had to do with the state issue and the state chief executive officer. I knew the arguments. Out of that meeting came the lawsuit of Crane versus Napolitano. That's Chris Crane, the president of the ICE union, as the lead plaintiff. And, of course, Napolitano is the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Janet Napolitano. That case went before the Northern District of Texas, the federal court, where Judge Reed O'Connor ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. That's the ICE union and the list of plaintiffs that are there, ruled in favor of it in 9 of 10 arguments and sent the other argument back to the executive branch to reword it in such a way that, I'll just use my terms, Mr. Speaker, it's more intelligible so he could answer and respond on that particular point. Generally, the decision was this. Judge Reed O'Connor essentially wrote, shall means shall, not may. I mean, if it requires that the agents put people that are unlawfully present in the United States in removal proceedings, that if it says they shall do so, then they shall do so. Shall means shall, it doesn't mean may, and there's no word in our language that's more definitive that can replace the word shall, and at least as far as legal parlance is concerned. That's essentially the decision. So it seems to be, and I'm optimistic that it's moving in the direction that we will get a final decision in a federal court, and perhaps the administration will appeal this on all the way up the line to the Supreme Court. But in the end, I can imagine how a judicial branch of government, how a Supreme Court could come down on the side of the President and decide that the President of the United States has the authority to make up laws he goes along or disregard laws he goes along. The President has argued that, well, at least the President and his spokesmen and women have argued that they have prosecutorial discretion. Prosecutorial discretion means that they can't enforce the law against every person who might violate the law because they don't have the resources. So the resources need to be targeted where they do the most good. That's prosecutorial discretion. I agree that that exists and that it's necessary that the discretion of prosecution exists. But I don't agree that the President can define broad classes of people that include hundreds of thousands in a single class and then decide that he's not going to enforce the law against any of them. That is what he has done. He's manufactured 4 classes of people and decided he's going to waive the law and all of these classes of people, suspend its enforcement. That turns out to be an invitation to more and more people to violate the law, even to the extent of we have had illegal aliens in the halls of the congressional offices that have lobbied members of Congress with impunity. And they will come in boldly and say, I'm exempted from the law by the President of the United States, so I can be here, and I demand that you agree with me and get me my college education. They have been inside the Judiciary Committee room. They have been introduced by the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee. That's how far this has gotten, Mr. Speaker. The contempt for the law, the contempt for the rule of law, and the sense of entitlement have gone beyond the pale. And so this rule of law, which be reconstructed now, because the verbal and keyboard jackhammers of the left have chiseled away at that beautiful marble pillar of American exceptionalism called the rule of law. And because they have done that, we must reconstruct it. And if we can't hold the rule of law together, if we can't restore it, if we can't reconstruct it, then it crumbles. If the rule of law, according to the bill, the Gang of Eights bill in the Senate, according to some of what seems to be moving here in the House, destroys the rule of law, at least with regard to immigration. It destroys it. There would be no enforcement of the rule of law with regard to immigration unless you committed a felony, you're here unlawfully, you commit a felony, or you commit a combination of 3 mysterious misdemeanors that happens to qualify you for removal proceedings. Those are exemptions that are part of it. They claim that they will enforce the law on that. A balance of it, if you cross the border illegally and come into the United States, that is a crime, Mr. Speaker. If you overstay your visa, which is about, let's say a number that approaches 40% of those who are unlawfully present in the United States, that's a civil misdemeanor, not a crime, at least today. If you do either one of those things only, they're not going to put you in removal proceedings. And if you come across into the United States and you defraud your employer and you come up with fraudulent documents and you use that in order to get a job, this administration isn't going to enforce document fraud, which is a felony against you. Essentially, they've said, if you can get into the United States legally or illegally, if you can stay in the United States, you can cheat to get a job. You can lie to your employer, you can use document fraud, and there won't be a penalty to any of these things. Essentially, nonviolent, peaceful crimes are not going to be a problem. But if you get engaged in some of the serious things like maybe drug smuggling or the crimes of violence that we all know about, then, or the threat of violence even, then it makes the administration uncomfortable and they might decide to send you back and put you in the condition that you were in before you broke the law. But peaceful people have been granted amnesty by the President of the United States. And this Congress has sat here almost placidly and accepted it as if he has that constitutional authority, and he does not. That's why the lawsuit of Crane versus Napolitano was filed, and it's a clear understanding from my standpoint. But the confusion seems to be that too many members that take an oath of office to preserve, protect, and defend this Constitution as well don't have a clear enough understanding of the brighter line between Article 1 and Article 2. Our job is to legislate, write the laws. The President's job is to enforce them. It's that simple. And yet, there was an interpretation that came out to us on the morning of November 7th. Wednesday morning, November 7th, Mr. Speaker, and a lot of people will understand and remember what that date was. That was the day after the election. Now, I was engaged in this election as much as I've been engaged in any election, and as a member of Congress from Iowa, I was also engaged in the presidential nomination and election process. Was engaged in the debate, and I've done events that have to do with presidential candidates on a relatively regular basis. I think I understood what the debate was about for the election for President of the United States. And as I listened to that, it was about jobs in the economy, jobs in the economy. If you would put jobs in the economy in quotes and attach it to, and then put Barack Obama's name in the search engine of Google, or put jobs in the economy in quotes and then put Romney or Mitt there and in the search engine of Google and send that off, you're going to get hundreds of thousands of hits altogether. Because that was the topic of the election last November 6th, jobs in the economy, jobs in the economy. And I told the Romney people, I've heard jobs in the economy so many times it puts me to sleep. Don't you think you're putting the American people to sleep by beating the same drum over and over again? But remembering the mantra, jobs in the economy, until we were just drubbed into numbness with it, also reminds us that the election was not, Mr. Speaker, about the immigration issue. I don't remember a debate between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney that went into any in-depth or substance on the immigration issue. And yet, before the sun came up on November 7th, some of the leading pundits and experts concluded that Mitt Romney would be president-elect by now before the sun came up on November 7th if he just hadn't said the two words self-deport, or if he had not been such a defender of the rule of law on immigration. Well, that was a surprise to me. I wish he'd have talked about it more. Well, he didn't. The election wasn't about immigration, but talking heads And let me say, erroneously pragmatic individuals in my party decided that they would contribute to this argument that came from both parties. And they drove the argument to the point where some people were convinced the election really was about immigration when it was not. And they argued that Mitt Romney would be president-elect if he had just gotten a larger percentage of the Hispanic vote. He would not, Mr. Speaker. If he had won the majority of the Hispanic vote in the swing states, he still would not have won the presidency. If he'd won 70%, he might have. But that didn't happen. And no one really thinks that's going to happen in the near future. So they came to a conclusion, thought they could support it with facts. They've learned now that they can't support their conclusion with facts, but they're determined to go forward with granting amnesty to, initially, they think 11 million people that are here in this country unlawfully, while providing the emptiest and most vacuous of promises that one day they're going to get around to putting a plan together, and if the plan happens to be implemented, they might secure the border. That's what's going on. And I don't know how in the world they can say this to the American people with a straight face and believe that there's going to be border security in exchange for law enforcement. It's not going to happen, Mr. Speaker. It didn't happen in 1986, one of only 2 times that Ronald Reagan let me down. But in 1986, the promise was this. We had about 1 million people in the country illegally. Actually, it started at 700,000 to 800,000. That sounds like a minuscule number today. That roughly 1 million people, and the debate raged in the House and the Senate. And I believed all along that good sense would prevail. I believe that the people who gave their oath to uphold the Constitution in the House and in the Senate would understand that they were undermining the rule of law if they granted amnesty to people that came into America illegally. I believed all along that they would understand that if they grant amnesty, they're going to get more lawbreakers, more illegal border crossers, a less manageable situation than the one they had in 1986. But the argument for clemency, for amnesty, prevailed in the House and the Senate. But I believe that Ronald Reagan would understand the principle of the rule of law clearly enough, and the long-term implications of such an act of amnesty in 1986 clearly enough, that he would take the authority that's vested in him, was vested in him in the United States Congress, to veto that legislation and require the Congress to pass amnesty by a 2/3 majority in the House and the Senate and overturn his veto. I do not believe they could have done that in 1986. I believed Ronald Reagan would veto the Amnesty Act in 1986, and instead, to my great disappointment, he signed it. The calculation at the time was, if we just grant amnesty to these 1 million people, we're going to get full cooperation to enforce the border, and never again will there be another Amnesty Act. Never again. This was the Amnesty Act to end all amnesty acts. It was going to be law enforcement from that point forward. The border was going to be secured. There was going to be a clear prohibition on hiring illegal employees. They were going to shut off the jobs magnet. And they created the I-9 form. The I-9 form, which requires an employer to fill out the form, make sure you've got the documentation, the identification, make sure you have all of the I's dotted and the T's crossed on the I-9 form, because a federal agent's going to come inspect your paperwork. An INS agent would come and inspect your paperwork. I did all of those things as carefully as I could. I had a fear that I would slip up and not meet the standard, Mr. Speaker. And so we very carefully documented our job applicants in my construction company to make sure that we were in compliance with the law, all the while expecting that that INS agent was just around the corner, taking a look at the paperwork of our competition or our neighboring business. Of course they never showed up to check my paperwork. I'm not disappointed by that. I'm disappointed they didn't show up to check the paperwork of thousands of employers with millions of employees. The enforcement didn't really happen. It didn't happen in shutting off the jobs magnet. The litigation began. The ACLU began litigating, and other organizations did, and they began to argue, you're requiring an employer to make a judgment call when he looks at the documents and the picture, the face of the person that's applying, and if you cannot require an employer to make a judgment call because it makes them liable for the lawsuit we're going to sue them with. And so the litigation of immigration turned it into a mess, intentionally, I believe, so that they could provide for open borders, which was the intention of the Teddy Kennedys and others at the time. And they undermined the enforcement effort politically, and they undermined it in the courts, and they undermined it culturally, and they began to convert the people who came here illegally into a victims group. And if you understand the politics of victimology, you understand that there's a certain amount of